All right, so we have about an hour and a half. We're going to try to get through everything and leave lots of time for questions and answers at the end. Today, we're using the Google Meet platform for our meeting session, and on your screen are the features of Google Meet. At the bottom left are the time and meeting information. At the bottom center are your controls that include the mute and unmute button. We ask that you remain muted throughout today's meeting unless you are speaking. The camera button, which turns video on or off. The closed caption button, which turns computer-generated closed captioning on and off in support of meeting accessibility. Also, in keeping with State of Maryland guidance on generative AI, please do not use AI meeting assistants of any kind. Any virtual assistants appearing in the meeting will be removed. Emojis are available by clicking on the reactions button that looks like a smiling face emoji. There is a raise hand function, and if you have a question, you can raise your hand at that time. Again, I would ask that everyone wait till the Q&A period at the end. And click on the red button with the phone receiver on it to leave the meeting on the right-hand side. On the bottom right of your screen are other features, including access to see meeting information, the participant list, and chat feature, which is the icon that looks like a word bubble. Going back to more options button, the 3 vertical dots in the center of your screen, clicking that button allows you to change how your screen appears and access other features. The Land Acknowledgement Statement is the first of our guiding documents that we shared at ground MSAC meetings. I'll read them aloud for accessibility purposes. The Land Acknowledgement derives from the MSAC Land Acknowledgement Project, in which MSAC staff consulted with tribal peoples whose lands are claimed by the state of Maryland. Visit msac.org for more information, including maps, tribal histories, key concepts, and best practices for making and delivering land acknowledgements. To go beyond performativity, MSAC is actively engaging with tribal peoples to understand barriers and improve accessibility to MSAC grant funding and other state resources. We acknowledge the lands and waters now known as Maryland are the home of its first peoples, the Accohonic Indian Tribe, Assateague Peoples Tribe, Cedarville Band of Piscataway Indians, Chopticot Band of Indians, Lenape Tribe, Nanticoke Tribe, Nase Wawash Band of Indians, Piscataway Conoy Tribe, Piscataway Indian Nation, Pocomoke Indian Nation, Susquehannock Indians, Youghiogheny River Band of Shawnee, and tribes in the Chesapeake watershed who have seemingly vanished since the coming of colonialism. We acknowledge that this land is now home to other tribal peoples living here in diaspora. We acknowledge the forced removal of many from the lands and waterways that nurtured them as kin. We acknowledge the degradation that continues to be wrought on the land and waters in pursuit of resources. We acknowledge the right of the land and waterways to heal so that they can continue to provide food and medicine for all. We acknowledge that it is our collective obligation to pursue policies and practices that respect the land and waters so that our reciprocal relationship with them can be fully restored. Next, our equity and justice statement overviews our commitment to these principles. The arts celebrate our state's diversity, connect our shared humanity, and transform individuals and communities. The Maryland State Arts Council is committed to advancing and modeling equity, diversity, accessibility, and inclusion in all aspects of our organization and across communities of our state. MSAC and its grantees are committed to embracing equity and non-discrimination regardless of race, religious creed, color, age, gender expression, sexual orientation, disability, class, language, and/or ability. The vision of the Maryland State Arts Council is that we play an essential role ensuring every person has access to the transformative power of the arts. Our mission is to advance the arts in our state by providing leadership that champions creative expression, diverse programming, equitable access, lifelong learning, and the arts as a celebrated contributor to the quality of life for all the people of Maryland. In 2024, our agency adopted a strategic plan ensuring the arts remain essential to Maryland's communities and economy. The plan includes 5 pillars, each with key goals. Access, bolster access to arts experience and resources. Awareness, amplify the stories of Maryland's arts sector and the value of public support. Connection, foster networks with and beyond the arts sector. Equity, cultivate a thriving arts ecosystem centered in equity. Leadership, commit to a culture of care and innovation. Firm information is available on our website, msac.org, under the About section, Strategic Plan. The following creative meeting actions were developed by MSAC staff to help guide our discussions and meetings. Please take turns coming off mute and reading one action. Oh, I'm just going to read them because we are going to move forward. So we have celebrate being in the space with other creative people, engage with everyone's presence as a gift, acknowledge that together we know a lot, enter the conversation with curiosity and inquiry, share your idea and trust that it will be heard, use I statements, focus your language on the task at hand, hold one another accountable with care, honor all perspectives and building on shared ideas, and balance speaking with listening. In addition to these actions, we encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat, and you can put your organization and your pronouns if you would like. MSAC offers free professional development regularly, including our info sessions, providing technical assistance for grant seekers, such as the one you're in today, topic-specific sessions covering legal issues, nonprofit and creative entrepreneurship, best practices, and other subjects of interest to the arts sector, informal virtual meet and greets that we call Coffee with the Council, and in-person office hours hosted around the state for people to get their questions answered directly by our team, and much more. MSAC also proudly sponsors the Maryland Arts Summit, an annual in-person convening providing opportunities to network, share accomplishments, and hold productive conversations on how to move the arts sector forward. The summit is organized by Maryland Citizens for the Arts, and it is linked in that slide. You can reach out with your ideas for future professional development sessions, as well as keep track of what's coming soon via the links at the bottom of the slide. So there are many ways to get involved with MSAC. Two important ways are by applying to be panelists or editor. Panelists review and score grant applications. And we'll be going into that a little bit more later in the presentation. Editors review program policies and make recommendations for changes. We post a schedule of panelist calls as well as information about applying to be a panelist or editor on the Ways to Get Involved page on our website. Applications are through our grants platform, which is called Smart Simple. We provide training and support, and the roles are compensated. Please consider helping out. So for today's session, we will be covering the general information about the Arts Capital Program, and we'll be digging into this year's application cycle and timeline. I will be leaving time at the end of the session for Q&A. So today we'll go over the Arts Capital Program overview, issues such as eligibility and funding. We're going to go over the application process as well as review and scoring, and we'll go over the rest of the things on the agenda, and again, have time at the end for Q&A. You can utilize the chat feature, and my colleagues Jess Porter and Ellie Maria will monitor the chat during the presentation. So to start, the purpose of our Arts Capital Grant Program is to provide eligible organizations with direct access to state capital funding for projects that enhance or create complete, usable, and accessible arts facilities. The Arts Capital Grant Program provides support for projects that involve the expansion, renovation, or major repair of existing facilities or infrastructure. Projects focusing on the construction of entirely new structures are also eligible, provided they result in a fully functional, accessible, and usable arts facility within the 2 years of fund disbursement. And we'll go into some of those nuances in later slides. One of the things that's written into the legislation that created this program is that we are looking for projects that increase access to arts facilities and programming throughout our state, specifically for people with disabilities, people of color, people living below the federal poverty level, or that expand access to new audiences. We also are strongly supporting projects that prioritize energy efficient building methods and technologies. And finally, projects that expand arts services by increasing usable programming space to create larger audiences for your wonderful programming you already have existing. So just to go into a little bit of the history of the program, it's, I think, really important to have context as to how we are here and why we're doing what we're doing. So something to know is that this was created through legislation in 2021 from the Maryland General Assembly, and our program launched in 2024. This is our third cycle in 2026, and we've learned a lot since the program launched. So we'll be going into some of those details later on. But to know that the law states that the governor will allocate $3 million annually in their budget from 2024 to 2029. And we hope that this program will be renewed past that time frame. The capital funding comes from the state general obligation funds, which are also known as GO bonds. And this capital funding is separate from MSAC's other funding, and therefore has different processes and regulations that we will go into more detail in the presentation. The Arts Capital Program was created to respond to the fact that many arts organizations face challenges in accessing state capital funds through budget line items and other means. This program is designed to create an accessible and equitable process for arts orgs to access arts capital funding through MSAC. Specifically, organizations with budgets less than $3 million. And this is so you can access your capital funds through MSAC. So hopefully same channels and similar processes that you're used to with our other grant programs, but obviously slightly different because we're using capital funding from GO bonds. So let's start by digging into what is eligible and what is ineligible for the Arts Capital Grant Program in 2026. So first, our basic requirements are that eligible applications must meet the following. You must be a nonprofit organization with an IRS designated 501c3 status, and you must be incorporated and based in Maryland. You have to have an annual operating budget, and that's important to stipulate operating, of less than $3 million. And then finally, you need to operate a physical property in Maryland that is either leased or owned by the applicant organization. One thing to note that's really important is that applicants must provide either proof of property ownership, such as a deed, or a lease agreement with the property owner showing a minimum of 5 years remaining at the time you submit your application this year. The other qualification is that you either must participate in MSAC's Grant for Organizations or County Arts Development programs, or be open to the public and provide arts-based cultural education or experiences. Some ineligible organizations would include units of government, so whether that's your town, Maryland State, the federal government. Colleges or universities are currently not eligible, as well as schools, which would include public or private, pre-K through 12. And auxiliary nonprofit organizations, which examples would include Friends of Groups, economic development organizations, but basically whose mission is primarily to benefit and fund specific activities, programs, or facilities that would otherwise be considered ineligible. Ineligible organizations also include fiscally sponsored organizations. And then one thing that should be coming into play as we're getting into further cycles of this program is past Arts Capital grantees that have either not completed their projects that they were awarded funding through Arts Capital for, and they must submit their final report and have it approved by MSAC staff. One thing to note is that we do have a cap of funding of $500,000 within a 5-year period. So if applicants have received $500,000, then they're ineligible to apply within that 5-year period. One thing to note that I'd be interested in seeing some people think strategically about in their applications is that you can also apply for a smaller phase or project that might be ready at this time, and then you can reapply in future cycles once you've completed the project and submitted your final report up to that $500,000 cap within those 5 years. So some of the ineligible projects include capital improvements to properties owned by schools, school systems, colleges, or universities, and capital improvements to properties owned by the State of Maryland Department of General Services or the Maryland State Authority. One thing that we'll have, and this is all in our guidelines, which are located on our website. So I would encourage, if you have not read our guidelines, to go and look those up and read through for this year. But we do retain the right that in some cases MAC staff might make eligibility determinations addressing situations not described here, but in support of the mission of the agency and the Department of Commerce with the guidance of the Department of Budget Management. So funding and use of funds. So the great thing about arts, or one of the great things about the Arts Capital Grant Program, is that we have grant thresholds anywhere from $50,000 to $500,000. So you are, as an organization, able to request what you need for your project. We are obviously trying to create a broad stroke to make as many organizations able to access these funds as possible. And so we know that project scope and size may change depending on where an organization is located or what they are working on. And so you can request anywhere from $50,000 to $500,000, and that is entirely up to your organization. We do not require a match, which is something that I love to share because that is fairly unique and a wonderful thing. And then finally, we're currently able to disperse the funding in one payment, which is 100% of the award goes to you after we get through the approval of the Board of Public Works and disbursement of funds to your organization. So it is not reimbursement based. So in terms of what you can think about using your grant funds for, again, I'll reiterate that we're looking for projects that involve the expansion, renovation, major repair, or new construction of facilities or infrastructure operated by the eligible organization. We are requiring that the projects must result in a facility or enhancement with a minimum useful life expectancy of 15 years. And that goes into part of the restrictions within capital funding, but that is, we're hoping that these projects will improve the properties for years and years to come, but we need a minimum of 15 years. And arts capital funds may only be used for a new project or phase of work. So if work has already begun before the grant award and Board of Public Works approval, it is not eligible for funding. And then up to 15% of the grant award may be allocated to indirect administrative costs related to the proposed project. And we encourage you to include that in your budget within your application. Some of the examples of our use of funds is you can think about exterior projects, but they must either result in expanded outdoor cultural or arts-related programming space or infrastructure, or directly improve the building's physical accessibility or visibility. New construction projects must include a project timeline and outcomes that demonstrate the feasibility of delivering a fully usable and operational arts facility within the project scope and funding support period. And finally, all project planning and implementation must adhere to local jurisdiction regulations, permissions, and permitting requirements for building-related capital improvements on public or private property. And as an applicant, you are responsible for conducting the research and ensuring compliance based on where you're located geographically. One important reminder is that if the applicant organization does not own the property or facility where the project will take place, you must show evidence of a long-term lease with a minimum of 5 years remaining on the lease term submitted as part of the application. And we'll go over that when we go into attachments. So now let's pivot to what they may not be used for. And so this is not exactly an exhaustive list, but these are important things to note as you think about what this funding can support. So the things that you may not use arts capital grant funds for include purchase of a building, land, or vehicles, signage projects that are not connected or physically attached to the facility, design services or purchases of equipment that are not part of a permanent capital improvement, feasibility studies or master plans, non-capital expenses such as research, studies, or pre-development costs unrelated to the capital project, debt service such as your mortgage, rent, or loans, activities for the exclusive benefit of an organization's members because the activities must, or your improvements must lead to improvements for access for the public, and then any indirect costs that you try to apply for in excess of that 15% amount. So 15% is the cutoff. Additionally, you may not use Arts Capital Grant funds for expenses to further sectarian religious instruction or in connection with the design, acquisition, or construction of any building used or to be used as a place for sectarian religious worship or instruction, or in connection with any program or department of divinity for any religious denomination. And again, reiterating that you cannot cover expenses that have already been completed at the time that you're applying. So these must be new phases of work or new parts of a project that you're working on, and expenses for which the applicant has been awarded funds through another MSAC grant program. So I'm going to pause and have a sip and just double check the comments. Okay, so application process. We are using Smart Simple, and so all applications are submitted via the secure online grants management system, Smart Simple. I think a lot of people are already familiar with this that are on the call today. So if you're not, applicants will need to be registered, and to be able to access this application, you must be registered as an organization. If you are not registered as an organization, say you have an individual artist account, then you must register as an organization, and you're going to need to use a different email address. Smart Simple will only allow one email address to be used, or you can only use one for each different profile. So if you are already in there, you're going to have to use a different email address. But we also offer any support around Smart Simple. So please let us know if you are having any troubles with that. This is the opening page of Smart Simple. So just to give you some context of what that looks like, you're going to, if you're new to the system, you're going to register on that bottom left-hand corner. And our web address for our Smart Simple account is located at the bottom of that screen. It's marylandarts.smartsimple.com to register, or for those that already have a login, you can log in there. And that will lead to you having your applications listed, and you'll find the Arts Capital Grant application under opportunities. And again, if you're listed as an individual artist, that will not be listed as an opportunity. It is only going to be listed for those that are listed as organizations. So you're going to do that. You're going to find the Arts Capital program in that list and click the Apply Now button to open the application. And so this is what the application will look like. You'll see our different sections along that top header, and we're going to go into more detail of each of those sections. But I do want to point out that you must click Save Draft to begin any application. And I would also suggest that you use that button often as you input things. This is a longer application than any of our other grant programs. So we expect people to work on it over time. So just as a friendly reminder to make sure you're saving your drafts as you go along. So these are our FY26 application sections that we will be going into more detail in the following slides. But we essentially have 4 sections of the application. The first one being mission alignment and project overview. The second being project plans, feasibility, and organizational impact. And section 3 is our community involvement and impact. So that is where all narrative or table information will be located. Section 4 is all attachments. So there is a list of required attachments as well as optional attachments that we'll go into more detail next. So section 1 is our mission alignment and project overview. So we'd like to have you include your mission and vision statement and an example of a recent success. And so what I would start by giving a tip to everyone is remember that the people that are reading your application might not have any experience with your organization or know what you do. And so we're really trying to gain some context from this first question, but throughout the application, so that way we can really understand what you're working on, what your needs are, what your challenges are, and how the Arts Capital grant will improve your work. And so the next area will be a description of your arts-based cultural education or experiences that are offered to the public by the organization. And we also would like to know a little bit more about what your audience and your community is like and who's being served currently by your program. Finally, in this area, we're going to ask for a high-level synopsis of your proposed project. We really want this to be less than 100 words. This is something that would really be the high-level summary of what you're working on with your project. And this statement will be shared in various ways, especially if you are chosen to be awarded the grant. And so really think of this as a public-facing area for you to complete. Next, we have our, in our mission alignment and project overview in section 1, we have our description of challenges. And so this will be the description of the challenges that your proposed project will address. We'd like to know specifically what are your facility or space challenges that you're facing as an organization. We want to hear how you're planning on addressing those challenges and how it will support your mission and or how will it contribute to your organization's long-term success. So some of the examples are listed there, but we really, again, have kind of a broad brush on all of the various projects that are being submitted to us. So these are just a few very limited examples of all of the things that people could apply for and how they could describe that. Next, we have our section 2, and this is we're talking more about your actual project and the feasibility and the eventual organizational impact of what your completed project will do. So just starting initially with the logistics of your location, we're going to ask for where the project is located, not where your organization is located. And we're also going to ask you to look up your legislative district as well as the latitude and longitude of the project location. And this helps us with information that we'll need to share further in the process with other departments or areas. So we do have links in the application on tools that will get you that information fairly easily. So let us know if you have any difficulties, but it should be through using those links able to be found. And so property ownership is the next area. And we need to make sure that the property is located in Maryland. We need to make sure that you have either ownership rights to the property you're proposing to improve, or that you have a lease that has at least 5 years remaining. And so one thing that we want to point out is that if awarded, an authorized representative of the property owner will need to sign the grant agreement. They will be listed as the beneficiary of the grant because the improvements are happening to their property. And so we really would like for you to provide accurate contact information for the property owner so that way we can also have access to that and assist to get any of the information we'll need throughout the process. One thing that we've learned over the last 2 years, that if the property is owned by a government entity, such as a city or county or various jurisdiction, please note that each jurisdiction has its own process for reviewing and approving agreements. In some cases, additional steps, such as review by a counsel or legal department, may be required before the agreement can be signed. We strongly encourage you to reach out to your property contact early to learn more about their process and any potential timelines, especially if it's a government-owned property. For example, in Baltimore City, if it's a Baltimore City-owned property, you may have to go through a process to have the grant agreement signed by the Board of Estimates, and then it'll come back into our process. So that's just good to know up front. It's good for you to start looking into that while you're filling out the grant application, and it's information that could prolong the timeline of disbursement of funds eventually. So in this next session, we're going to be really thinking about how did you plan and what is your timeline for your project. So we're asking specifically this year for what planning activities were conducted. We're looking for whether that's studies or consultations, if you have identified solutions that have been created from your project planning area, but that area to really help us to understand what you've done to get to this point when you're applying for the Arts Capital Grant Program. Next, we're going to have our timeline development section. And so we want a detailed description of the project and its intended outcomes. And what we'd really like for organizations to think about is how each project may be divided into phases or planning of work, and really explain that as best you can. Again, for those that are reviewing, it's really helpful to understand the connection between large projects and like how they're being broken into smaller components, or what phases specifically the arts capital funding will be used for. The next question that we'll ask is, how will the project team ensure the project will be delivered on time and within budget? And so with that, our on time really refers to 2 years after disbursement of funds. And so we really are looking for projects that will be able to be completed within that time period. And so we're also asking for a narrative of your project schedule, and there's a table that will be associated that will go into more detail in the next slide. So this is our timeline table. This is something we've edited slightly for this year to make it hopefully a little bit easier for everyone to have consistent information. But basically, this chart will be available to you in the Smart Simple application. You're going to need to click the plus sign to, or click the button that will say schedule, and it will bring you up to that table that's on the bottom of the slide. So you'll see on the far left, it says phase or sub project. So we're looking at like whether that's phase 1 or if it's the sub project of working on the roof or whatever, for examul. Next, you're going to, in the next column, do your activity or task. This is just going to be kind of the name or label of that activity, such as roof repair. And then the description is really where you can go into more details. And we really, it's 1, required, but 2, we really encourage you to fill this information out as thoroughly as you can. We want to understand what you're working on and every piece that goes into it. And that's really how we can make the best decisions. So you really help us to understand what each of those activities and tasks look like and entail, then that will really help everyone to do that. With the start and end date, we're looking for approximates for the intent of this activity. We're asking for you to think of the project support period being May 1, 2026 to May 1, 2028. And that would be the support period, but know that that's a 2-year support period may shift depending on the grant disbursement date. So once we actually disperse funds to the organization, then you'll have 2 years from that time to complete your project. And so we won't really know that specific date until we get closer to May. And so we will let organizations know what that adjusted disbursement date. So for the intention of this activity, please use that window of May 1, 2026 to May 1, 2028, and then we can go from there. One, I know I think I've reiterated this a couple of times already, but again, the schedule must reflect a project that upon completion results in a new or enhanced usable and accessible arts facility. And so that's really what the goal is and what is the basis of this Arts Capital grant program. So when we look at the project budget, this is going to be the next section after your timeline. This will be both a narrative and another chart to fill out. So the first question that we will ask is our total estimated expenses associated with your proposed capital project. And that would be all costs except that you would need to complete your project. So we understand that some projects may fall way outside of the funding of $500,000 as the max. And so we want to make sure that we have all total expenses that you expect to need to complete the project. Now, for the Arts Capital grant amount requested, that's specifically the funding you're asking from the Arts Capital grant program. So that's anywhere between the $50,000 and $500,000. You will be flagged as ineligible if you have a request anywhere outside of that range, but you can use any amount within the $50,000 to $500,000 to request from the Arts Capital grant program. And then we're going to ask you to complete the project budget chart. And so again, we're hoping that you will be able to deliver a clear, detailed, and realistic financial plan for both the income and expenses tied to the proposed project. And so again, in Smart Simple, you will see in the budget area a budget button that you can click, and then there will be a new tab that opens with the budget chart. And this is what the budget chart will look like. We're going to ask you to complete this, and you'll see that there are 3 areas here. The top area is all of the project expenses that you're hoping to have supported by the Arts Capital Grant. And then the second line down will be the project expenses. So all that will be supported by other non-Arts Capital Grant income. So whether that's other grants, other fundraising activities, or donations, etc. And then the bottom column is the totals. So you're going to see the left says total expenses, Arts Capital supported, and then the far right will be grant total, all project expenses. The total expenses Arts Capital supported should line up with your answer in the application for how much money you're requesting. So just make sure those 2 numbers are the same when you go to submit your application. This is just a pulled out version of the budget. So you'll see in this far left category is our drop down of different categories that we have pre-populated for you. These are kind of the big buckets that we've seen in past applications, but we also know that this is by far not an exhaustive list. And so we encourage you to use the other construction expenses category to explain any other that go outside of those drop-down options. And then we do ask that you make sure that in the column to the right, you go into more details, and then the amount of that item will be on the far right column. And so this, again, the more description or context you can give us, the stronger your application will be in helping us to understand the full scope of your project and how all the pieces are fitting together. Sorry about that. Okay, so we will be asking some narrative questions to go with your budget chart. And so one is, how did you determine that the costs are reasonable? We want you to list any quotes that you've obtained. That is not mandatory, but it does, again, help us to understand what planning and pre-work has gone into your application. And if the budget for the overall project exceeds the Arts Capital Grant amount, we would like to know how you plan on leveraging non-state funding to complete the project. And so, we would like to know if you have pending funds, or you've secured funds already, or if you have requests out to funders for different parts of that. But that just, again, helps us to understand the feasibility of the project in terms of the funding that will be needed to completely finish your project. And if the budget for the overall project does not exceed the Arts Capital Grant, you can just enter non-applicable, or NA. So finally, in section 2, we have our operational capacity and project team. And so we're going to ask what the organization's background is in completing similar projects, whether that's capital projects or other large-scale projects. We want to know, if there's previous experience within your organization to do projects like the Arts Capital project that you're proposing. We'd also like for you to list all of the partners or staff that will be included in and involved in the project. We'd like you to know their roles. We'd like to know how they were selected and any of their relevant past experiences, again, to give context to what project team will be working on this project for you. And then finally, organizational sustainability. The questions we're asking here is really helping us to understand, but also hopefully giving more context to your grant project, because we know that capital grants can be huge, cumbersome projects for the organization. So we're just hoping that you can help us to understand how this will impact your long-term operational and financial sustainability. And we'd also like to know if there's any changes that you foresee because of this project. So whether that be projected cost savings, new expenses related to facility changes, whether you need new staffing to staff this new space. And then there's additional operating costs. So, if you've put in new systems, maybe you'll have higher BG&E bills or other operational costs that you need to account for. And so then finally, we'd like to just know how your organization is planning to manage those changes. And then we're moving on to section 3. And this is our final narrative section of the application. And thank you all for listening to me for the last 45 minutes or so. But we're almost to the part where we can start talking about your questions. So section 3 is where we're going to be asking about the community involvement and impact. So the first area is our community voice section. And so we're wanting to know, who are your stakeholders for this project? Who will be impacted? Who will have greater access to your facility? So we want to know how you've engaged and collected feedback, because we want to know how that impact or how that community feedback has shaped your project. And then community impact, we want to know how this project will positively impact your immediate and surrounding communities, as well as the county the project is located in. And then the next question we'll ask is, does this project address a critical need in your community? And please elaborate there. A yes or no would be, my tip would be to give a little bit more context there. Next, in our section 3, we have accessibility outcomes, and this goes right back to mandates within the legislation from 2021. And so we want to know how this project will enhance facility or program accessibility for people living with disabilities. We want to know any specific features, impacted groups, how representatives from those communities were involved, and how that's helped to develop the proposed solutions that you're submitting in your application. And then we also want to know, does this project improve access to the organization's facility or programs for people of color and people living below the federal poverty level, as well as just expanded audiences for your facility? Next, in section 3, we'll be looking for local workforce opportunities and inclusive hiring practices. And so we're asking, will this project create new employment or workforce development opportunities that can be either within the work of creating your capital project, or it could be from result of what will happen when that project is completed. And we would really like to know what your current inclusive hiring practices are and how they're going to be used to select contractors, vendors, or any new staff that will result from this project moving forward. So now we're on to section 4. We're done with the narrative section of the application. And so section 4 is all of our required attachments. And I'll just go through the list because they're all parts of the application that will allow you to be eligible. So we're asking that you have 2 letters of support. One is from your local governing body representing the area that the project, not your organization, because we know sometimes they're not the same. But we want to know who is representing your local area and make sure that they are knowledgeable of your project and also supporting that. And then finally, your state senator or delegate. So those are your 2 letters of support. Again, I've said this before, and maybe, obviously these are one of the lessons we've learned over the last 2 years, but we need to have in the application a signed deed providing property ownership. So if you own the property, we are going to need a copy of the signed deed attached to your application. And then if you're leasing or renting a space, we're going to need your current lease showing at least 5 years remaining on the agreement from the date of the application. So we need 5 years after you submit this application, and that needs to be also submitted as an attachment in your application. And then finally, project imagery for this, it's really open. We are asking for 1 reference image being required. So that can be a current state photo, that can be any architectural sketches or renderings you may have made. It could be pictures of equipment that you plan on purchasing through this project. It's really open to what you're proposing, but we would like at least 1 reference image. And for me, in reviewing the last 2 years' applications, I would recommend everyone to really think about your space and like, how are you helping to tell the story of your grant proposal? Remember that, the people reviewing your grants and scoring the grant aren't necessarily going to know either where you are geographically or what your organization or building facility currently looks like. And I found that sometimes having current photos of the current state of your facility can help give that context that will help support your narrative that you provided earlier in the application. And then we're going to need various organizational documents and financials. And so that will include your operating budget, your financial statement, the IRS Form 990, your 501c3 letter of determination as a nonprofit. And then we do require your most recent audit if your organizational budget is over $750,000. There are 2 optional attachments that we are also having in the application. So this is up to you if you attach these, but we are this year asking for a letter of support from the property owner. Again, this is optional, but we hope that as you are starting to put together your application, that you have been in discussion with your property owner and that they know what you're applying for, because we will need them to sign the grant agreement form at the end if you are awarded the project. And so this is really important to have them in the conversation as early as possible. And if you can get a letter that from them that states that they support the project, that is just strengthening your application. And then we have optional project quotes or estimates, which is copies of any quotes or estimates you received during your project planning area. And again, this is not required, but we strongly encourage it because it does help, to give that context, especially when we look back at your project planning answers and your budget and timeline. It does help to see that there have been some quotes or estimates generated, and those can be attached here. All right, so we're going to move on to application review and scoring. I hope that you now have a better understanding of our application process and what the application in Smart Simple will be asking. I want to give a little plug to look at our FY26 guidelines. All of the application questions are going to be listed in there, as well as the associated rubric questions, and it gives more context of all this that we're presenting today. So it is a really great resource to reference after this presentation. So moving on to application review and scoring. The first step after we receive the applications is that we will review them for completeness and eligibility. And so we will notify you if your application is incomplete, and if additional information is necessary, we will give you a specific deadline in writing to provide any revisions and or necessary information. And applications must meet all of these specified deadlines, or the application will be considered incomplete and withdrawn. And then a thing to note, and I think this is important to know, is that staff do not score applications. So I do not score. I will not be the one that scores any of your applications, but we do provide support for you and for our panelists throughout the process. So next is our panel review. For those new to MSAC, we convene groups of panelists representing a range of expertise, especially with Arts Capital. As you can imagine, Arts Capital grants require a lot of different experiences, backgrounds, and skills. And so we are really looking for panels that reflect the different components that will be needed and the different expertise that can help weigh in on the various applications that we'll be receiving. So members from the public apply to be panelists, and then they will receive specific training about the program, about implicit bias in grant making, the scoring rubrics, and more. And so the panelists review and score applications in 2 rounds. All eligible applications are reviewed by public panelists. So the first round, all of the panelists will independently review and score and provide comments to the eligible applications, and the highest scoring applications advance to round 2. In round 2, the panel will meet virtually as a convened group, and it presents and participates in discussion over each application, and they have the opportunity to then rescore the application based on that conversation. That meeting is open to the public. but it is, you can't participate in it. You will only be able to view, but those are the opportunity for the panel to get together as a group and really talk about the applications that have made it to that round. So after the panel, my apologies. This is a beginning little cut of our Arts Capital rubric for this year. And so the panel will use this rubric to score applications. You can find the rubric on our website at that web address, but you can kind of see how it will be laid out. We have each section. So for example, section 1, mission alignment and project overview. And then we'll have each subcategory within that section with examples of scores that would warrant excellent to outstanding ratings down to fair to marginal. So the rubric is a really great resource for you to know how the scoring will occur and what we're going to be looking for in terms of the Arts Capital grants for this year. So once the second panel occurs, the panel's final scores are averaged and sorted high to low. Scores and comments are taken into consideration for grant award recommendations. And at the discretion of MSAC staff, the funding recommendations may be made for the full or partial request amount, depending on the total budget available and eligibility review of expenses proposed. So once we've gone through this whole process, there are 3 categories that applications will be categorized into. And so the 3 of them are either pending approval, which means that you have been chosen by the panel and the staff to move forward in the process, or your application will be declined or it will be ineligible. So the applications that do not receive funding generally fall into one of the 2 categories of ineligible or declined. And an application is generally marked ineligible if it's not complete or does not comply with the eligibility requirements of the Arts Capital grant. And so again, please look back into the guidelines or our website to really review that eligibility and use of funds area, because that is one way that you could be marked ineligible. And an application can be marked ineligible at any time during the review process. If your application is declined after the application is considered eligible and it's gone through the panel review, it can be declined for several reasons. It may be due to the funding allocation limitations at the time. We're really happy to have $3 million to disperse, but $3 million for all eligible organizations for the state of Maryland annually goes fairly quickly. So it is a competitive grant opportunity. And so there are always going to be funding allocation limitations. But also some of the other reasons could be required information is incomplete or insufficient to make the award determination. There are material inconsistencies between the application and the organization's actual operations. And there are significant operational, financial, or other circumstances that reasonably suggest the applicant is or may become unable to use the grant funds in alignment with the grant guidelines and agreement. So some things to know in terms of Smart Simple. In terms of notification, you will be notified of any of those categories when we are done with the review process. And the individual listed as a primary contact, as well as any other contacts on the organization's account, will be notified. And the automated notifications will be sent from Smart Simple. So make sure you've checked your spam folder or save that email. So hopefully it will go right through to your inbox. And we also have the ability to give you feedback, which is really useful for organizations. And so you can request feedback after we've gone through the cycle, and it can be whether you're ineligible, declined, or approved for funding. And we'll have a feedback request form that we'll send the link out along with the grant notification emails. Next, we have our approval and disbursement area. So like I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we have gone through 2 cycles so far. And so we are learning the process as we continue having more cycles of this application. And so I just wanted to put in here the steps that happen after your application has been approved by the panel and by the staff, and you've been notified that your grant is pending approval. In other grant programs, that would mean that you were awarded and you're moving forward. But in terms of Arts Capital, there is this nuance. And so you will be listed in Smart Simple as pending approval until it is ultimately approved by the Board of Public Works. And so you'll hear BPW mentioned a lot, excuse me, and it stands for Board of Public Works. But in terms of the review, once we have selected our FY26 grantees, then we will bundle those grants and share them with our colleagues at the Maryland Historical Trust for their Section 106 review. And so they will review those, give us back comments, and so then we'll share those with the organization, whether they have identified potential historical implications to your project or not. And then from there, once that is finished and we've communicated that to you, then we will be sending the grant agreement to you for your signature, as well as the beneficiary signature if it is a leased property. So again, that's the important part of making sure your building owner knows that this is something that they will need to sign, or again, if it's a government entity. And so once the GAP is returned to MSAC, it needs to be signed by various members of our Commerce Department team. And once we get that fully signed, then we will package up all of your materials that you've submitted, and we'll submit that for inclusion on a future Board of Public Works meeting agenda item. I will say that this has taken some time in both of our last 2 rounds. So that is one of the reasons why I wanted to make sure that we're communicating this up front this year, as we've learned a little bit more about the process. But your grants are not fully approved until they have been at the BPW meeting and have been approved. So that is why we say that you cannot use your funds until that point, because the BPW could choose not to approve it for one reason or another. And so we want to make sure that it's clear that you are not fully approved for the Arts Capital Grant until the BPW meeting is completed. And so what happens at this time is you've gotten approval from the BPW, and so you'll receive your funding in one payment. You'll get the 100% of the award amount after the grant agreement is approved by the Board of Public Works, and it goes through our disbursement process. Again, a warning on the bottom here, we are estimating, and this is the minimum time that we expect to go from notification of your grant status to disbursement is going to be 6 months. Minimum of 6 months. So please take that into account in your planning for this grant and when you can expect the funding, because we really would like the timelines to be able to line up as much as possible. And you are estimating that you will not get those funds for at least 6 months after the notification of your grant status. If they come sooner, we will be absolutely excited and everyone can celebrate. But we do want to warn that this is taking a very long time to get through, and we want to make sure that our organizations are prepared for that when they submit their applications. So you're here today, so you've obviously heard that we have the info session today. Our application is open on Smart Simple, and as well as all of our the guideline and updated information on our website. Our application deadline is the end of Friday, October 3rd. And so 11:59 p.m. is our application deadline. We will be holding our panel meetings right after the holidays in January. And we expect to be able to notify all of the applicants of their status in February of 2026. In terms of the final report and support period deadline, we are estimating, again, May 1 to June 1, so May 1, 2026 to May 1, 2028 will be the support period. And so that's the time that we expect you to be working on your project and working towards completion. So that way you will be able to submit your final report in approximately June 2028. That is tentative, and again, we will update the grantees once the funds are dispersed as to what the actual timeframe will be. So we make sure it's accurate and realistic. But that is right now our estimated timeline for 2026. And I just went over all this, so for a matter of time, all of this can be found in our guidelines, and it's, again, something to reference as you are putting together your application. So getting to the final part of our presentation, we have some tips and next steps that can help guide where you should go from here. So one, think about your eligibility criteria. Are you a 501c3 organization registered in Maryland? If you're not, you will not be able to get into question 2 of the Smart Simple application, essentially. And we need to know if your operating budget is below $3 million. Unfortunately, if your operating budget is above $3 million, you are not eligible for this program. The next is thinking about your proposed project. Does it fit with the eligibility? Does it improve or produce a complete, usable, and accessible arts facility? Does the project include expansion, renovation, or major repairs to a facility or other infrastructure? If you lease, do you meet the minimum 5-year lease requirement that we'll need at the time of submitting the application? If you answered yes, or maybe you're not sure, you can find time to speak with me, Abby Neyenhouse, the Arts Capital Program Director. There's a link there for my calendar, so you can go ahead and schedule a 30-minute meeting with me, and we can talk about it further if you have any questions. You can also send me an email, so there's my email address, or you have my mobile phone number there, and you can text or call. I would say calling is probably the longest you'll wait, so the other methods are going to be the easiest way to get on any of those. Again, a little reminder to visit our website. Our Arts Capital website has all of these items available for you to look as you prepare your application. Again, the program guidelines are a great tool. Please review those and look through all of those areas. We went through a lot of that information in the presentation today, but there is more in the program guidelines. And again, it's a great reference piece. You can also find our scoring rubric on our website. You can see the past Arts Capital professional development videos that my colleague Ryan Patterson put together in the 24 and 25 cycles. We also have the link to the legislation language. Again, I think it's important to know the history of where things come from, and also a lot of our questions and the things that we're scoring are directly from the legislation and what we're mandated by law. We do have our list of FY24 and FY25 Arts Capital Award grantees, as well as short program descriptions, so you can get an idea of who's been granted in the last 2 cycles, and so much more. And now we are here for questions. So I have my colleagues, Jess Porter and Ellie in the chat. So we'll open it up for any questions anyone might have.
Hey, Monica, if you had a question, you're welcome to come off mute.
Okay. Hi, thanks, Abby. This was awesome. I actually put my question in the chat as well. I was just wondering, so in terms of the planning phase, would design consulting and architectural consulting be considered an allowable expense for the project if it's directly related to the site?
Some of those can be eligible expenses, so we should schedule time and chat more.
Okay.
This is Jess, just chiming in here. Monica, as long as those expenses are part of a larger project that will actually result in some physical changes, like it can't just be planning.
Right.
These grants can't only be used for planning, but like engaging architects or other experts can be eligible expenses if they still result in a complete and usable facility.
Yes, that's what I was thinking, just in terms of like, getting some cohesion around the project itself, as we're working through it. If that was something, of course, that would be part of leading into the final design and application of the funds.
Yeah, it sounds like Abby would be a good person
Okay.
to talk to in a little bit more detail, but I'm sure you'd be able to put together an application.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, Monica, please schedule a time to call. There's just so much nuance in some of it that it's hard to do a blanket.
Yeah.
I'm looking through the chat and there are some questions here. The one is about Churchill Theater, Juanita. And so they're asking, Churchill Theater owns its building and we have conveyed a historic easement to the Maryland Historical Trust. We have much work that needs to be done on our building and the majority of it has been approved by MHT. Should we include copies of their approval letters with our application? I would say go ahead. It wouldn't hurt to include that and it helps to give us a little bit more context. But we'll also be in conversation with MHT, so it's not required or you don't have to do that. But yeah, if you have them, you can go ahead and attach them as well. And then I see a question again from Monica. Do most BPW grant approvals happen at the same time? Meaning, do all grantees receive awarded funding generally in the same time frame? I would say no. We've now had the two batches, FY24 and FY25. And so in FY24, we were able to get 12 of our 14 grants in front of the BPW in May of this year, May 2025. And we're now getting our final two onto a BPW meeting agenda in the near future. So we do try to batch them up as much as we can, but we're also trying to make sure we're not holding up the majority of the group while we're waiting for some other challenges to be remedied, or like I said earlier in the presentation, if there's a government entity or another process that needs to go into it, that could delay your completion of the grant agreement, and therefore it could set you off track from kind of the bulk of the applicants. But our goal is to submit a bulk of them all together for the BPW, because it is challenging to get on the BPW agenda because it's, statewide approval that needs to happen on a lot of items. So we're trying to request as infrequently as we can to make sure we're moving those quickly. Okay, other.
Abby, would it be helpful? There's a couple people with their hands raised. I can help call on some of those folks.
Oh, that would be really great, Jess. Thank you.
Sure thing. Christopher?
Hi, yes, I'm on my phone, so it's hard for me to type in a question. But so I work for an organization called the Alice Ferguson Foundation, and we're primarily an outdoor science education organization, but we do have a lot of art and culture lessons incorporated into our curriculum, including a lot about the Piscataway people who were the original inhabitants of our property and our neighboring Piscataway Park. So we have a big project coming up for the Maryland 250 celebration where we've secured a lot of funding from NPS, from the National Park Foundation, as well as Maryland 250 to do a few different things on our campus. But one of them is to host a Piscataway exhibit at our environmental center, which will include replicas of artifacts that have been modeled, 3D modeled in partnership with the Smithsonian, and we'll have a lot of informational signage and lessons and speakers going on. And after that exhibit, we plan to move it and make it a permanent display in a different building on our campus. So I'm just wondering if that is something that could be funded by this grant or not, like, because I just don't want to spend the time on it. And I know this grant is primarily for arts focused organizations, but this project is very, art and culture focused. So just wondering your feedback about that. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Christopher. So I would recommend, once again, scheduling a meeting because it really would depend on, kind of the long-term usage of the equipment, and if it's kind of a permanent improvement or if it's going to be movable. So there's just a couple of nuances to that I would want to know more about before I, suggest if it was eligible or not. I mean, it sounds like an absolutely amazing project, and kudos. For us, the stipulation is that you have to be, an organization who's primarily doing arts and culture activities and open to the public. And so, it sounds like the project could be eligible, but it depends on what you would be requesting in terms of equipment, because again, with capital funds, we're looking for something that will last at least those 15 years after the project is completed. So, Christopher, if you could schedule a meeting with me, I would love to chat even more about that in depth.
Sure. Thank you. I'll schedule with you.
Great.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Christopher. And thanks, Abby. Robin, did you still have a question? Okay, maybe Robin's all set. I see your hand is down now. Kathy?
Hi, I'm sorry. I wanted to go back to the process. Abby, when you were talking about the preliminary decision that the Arts Council makes, and then, of course, going before the Board of Public Works and scheduling that, everyone has to submit quotes as part of their application. How have past awardees been able to retain the amounts that they thought the project was going to cost, and yet once it's all the way through the process and then another possible 6 months to even get a check, how are they tackling the fact that at that point that quote is so out of date it doesn't represent the actual project cost?
Yeah. No, that's a great question, Robin, and that's something that we are actually working on right now to have a process for change of scope. So that way there's a formal way for organizations to notify us and get approval for any changes that need to happen, especially from the first 2 years. We've learned a lot in terms of how long this process takes, which is why I wanted to make sure in this presentation we're kind of warning organizations to think about that in terms of how long it will take to get the funding in hand. But you can also do contingencies in your budgets. We also, the quotes, I want to clarify that the quotes are not required. They're just recommended attachments, but they are not required. So I just want to make sure that's clear for everyone on the call, because again, we want to make sure that this is open to all size projects and scopes for eligible organizations and projects. Yeah, we, will obviously work with organizations as, the funding comes through. And if there needs to be changes, that's something we'll work with the organization on. And there is a little bit more information on that in the guidelines that you could reference.
Thank you.
I think I'm next, Kathy. Thanks, Abby. This has really been so helpful. And I think my question speaks to scope, but in a slightly different sense.
Okay.
Is it possible to apply for several different types of projects? For example, I'm thinking of a package that would be upgrades to best practices package in a sense. So it'd be 3 parts, and one would be best practices and accessibility. So we, really need upgrades to our bathroom access. So we need that. That's one part of the project. Another would be best practices in exhibition preparership and design. We need to upgrade our exhibition practices, and so that they're more on par with what artists need and want for the advancement of their own careers and more engaging for visitors. And third would be best practices in attracting community. We need capital-based improvements to our facade and to the grounds in order to be more attractive and more inclusive of the community. So is it possible to have several different types of projects going within one package, within one grant?
Thank you, Kathy. My first question was like, are you proposing 3 applications? But yes, that is absolutely possible. We just would want to make sure there's some kind of through line in the narrative,
Right.
Really make sure that can be understood by, the staff and panelists that are going to be reviewing the application. And as long as it relates back to your mission, that's fine. So if it's eligible expenses and there's kind of 3 different projects that all fit into the arts capital parameters, that is absolutely fine to put those in. Again, I would just make sure that, you have a narrative that the panel can follow when you're explaining that, and why, like how it will holistically help your facility. And obviously also it needs to be within that $500,000 cap.
Right. Excellent. Thank you so much, Abby.
Welcome. Thanks, Kathy.
Abby, I think that's it that was in the queue, but yeah,
Great.
welcome anyone else to. Oh, Robin's back.
Yeah. One more question, circling back to my prior question about quotes. You said we don't have to submit quotes. Then how do we legitimize the budget that we have to explain in the application?
Well, they're optional. So obviously, if you're able to submit them, and have that, if you have that available, then that helps to legitimize your application and the project you're proposing. So, it's just, there might be a really small project, like, someone that's asking, a relatively small project. All projects are important and sizable to each organization, but, there might be a way different, planning going into, say, something that is going to require 50,000 compared to something that requires 500,000. But it will obviously strengthen the application and, as you said, kind of further legitimize the project, because we are looking at, whether this is feasible and can be completed within the 2-year support period. So if you are able to submit that will obviously strengthen your application and strengthen, the narrative that you're submitting.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So if there's no other questions, I did change the slide to the information you can access me through. And if you have any questions at all, please let me know. We're really excited to be launching FY26, and I'm here to answer any questions and support you through the process. Reminder, the application is due October 3rd. So please, if you need to schedule some meetings, get on doing that soon, so we have time to meet and you have time to work on your application. But thank you all today for joining us and for making it almost the whole 90 minutes. So have a great rest of your day, and I look forward to hearing more from all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Abby.